Welcome, everybody, to an all-new episode of Fighting Lines with Brian Ciano. Thank you so much for joining me as I take my weekly look at everything going on in the world of combat sports. There is a lot of news to break down throughout combat sports. We have two eras of women's MMA meeting up for the first time in an announced fight coming up later this year. We'll talk about that and the promotion that is surprisingly putting it on. We'll also hit on one guy that just can't seem to get out of his way. You give him a mic and he's going to embarrass himself in the UFC. That was a big topic of discussion as well. Also, we have an all-time great in boxing coming back out of retirement. What are the reasons? Probably pretty obvious. We'll hit on that as well. Then later on, we'll hit on the PFL announcing a bunch of fights for their cards coming up over the next few months. And finish off with a big beef in boxing that took a couple different turns this week, including a big slap in the face and stealing of one of the top fighters by one promotion from another. All that coming up on Fighting Lines with Brian Ciano. Make sure you follow us on social media. On X, it is at Fighting Lines. On Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook, it is at Fighting Lines Pod. Wherever you're partaking of the show, whether it is Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, make sure you like, subscribe, share, comment, get it out there, get involved, hook other people up with the show as well, so we can continue talking to you about everything going on in the world of combat sports. Let's get right into it now with a big matchup in women's MMA that has been announced. All right, one of the big stories in combat sports this week was a huge announced fight between two women that define different eras of MMA as we get a battle that was kind of rumored for a long time between Gina Carano and Ronda Rousey, but it's with a very different situation than we thought. This is not Ronda Rousey returning to the UFC. This is not Ronda Rousey going to boxing, as some people talked about. This is her returning to MMA, but with MVP promotions. Ronda Rousey fighting Gina Carano for Jake Paul's MVP at the Intuit Dome, May 16th, Inglewood, California, on Netflix. That's right, MVP getting into the MMA game, possibly, at least for this fight, and doing it on Netflix. That's significant on multiple levels. First of all, we know that Dana White and Jake Paul do not get along. Jake Paul's been a huge critic of Dana White and the way he treats fighters for years now. So there is no love lost there. And now he takes one of the biggest draws from the UFC in the history of their women's division in Ronda Rousey and brings it to Netflix for the first time, who was rumored to be in negotiations for the UFC before Paramount Plus swooped in there and scooped all those rights up. Interesting combination here. Now, we found out a lot of this was actually in the works for a while. Apparently, Ronda Rousey brought it to Dana White before this ended up with Jake Paul and MVP, and Dana White decided that wasn't right for them, not something they wanted to do, so they turned it down. Understandable, with Ronda Rousey not fighting since 2016, Gina Carano not fighting since 2009. This is, one of those legacy fights, fighters that haven't been around for a while, all of a sudden coming back, trying to make a buck, trying to get the attention that they haven't had for a while. So you understand that's not the UFC business model. That is much more suited to MVP, who has done things like this many times with Jake Paul fighting various people who are not in their prime, not in the tip of people's tongues right now, but still making a huge deal out of it, still getting huge audiences on Netflix. So they will continue to do that now with these two legends. Now, of course, they never fought each other. Apparently, this was in the works possibly years ago, over a decade ago. They talked about this fight happening, maybe in the UFC when Ronda was in her prime with the UFC. Gina was still a couple years out from fighting, but had made her name in acting and was thinking about coming back. And things did not go well between her and Dana. Dana decided to do what he does and kind of get upset about someone asking for what they felt they were worth and insulted her, and the relationship soured, and that was it right there. But apparently things have been patched up since, but still was not interested in this fight. So now Jake Paul puts us on. Rousey, the 39-year-old, coming back for her first fight in 8 years. Carano, the 44-year-old, coming back for the first time in 17 years. Now, this isn't exactly like some of the other fights that we've seen put on in this elk. This isn't Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson, where both these guys are in their 50s or, way past their prime. Gina Carano hasn't fought in almost 17 years, but she quit in her prime. She was still a young fighter when she gave it up because women's MMA was not what it is now. That was helped to be built up further by Ronda Rousey after her. But the door was opened by her and others, her and Cyborg. For those of us who've been watching women's MMA for a long, long time, who go back to Strikeforce and what they put on, not just with women, but in MMA in general, that was probably the fight that really drew a lot of people in and let them realize that women's MMA was legit and it was something to be enjoyed and watched. And they were just as high level martial artists as a lot of these men. You know, that fight was a great fight. Honestly, I thought Gina Carano had a chance to win that fight against the unbeatable Cyborg, had her on the mat and then let her back up instead of just trying to, throw shots on her from there. Maybe she was worried about getting tied up, but that's neither here nor there. Gina Carano at the time was coming off being on American Gladiators, the revival of that on network TV. And all of a sudden this fight came around and a lot of people were interested. A lot of people tuned in to see if this was, a real fight, if women's MMA was legit. And they proved it was. And because of that, the door was open to live with people like Ronda Rousey to come in after that and blow it up and make it what it was. Because, of course, still after that fight, Dana White said he would not put women's MMA in the UFC. And eventually, when Ronda Rousey started her run and started proving how badass she was, that convinced him to make the women's divisions. And we've seen what it become today with, women continuing like Amanda Nunes, Cyborg still fighting in her last fight. You had Kayla Harrison come around, another judo, Olympian like Ronda Rousey. So it has been grown. It has been blown up to something that is definitely a lot bigger than it was years ago when Gina Carano left to go do movies instead at 2009. But she was a big part of pushing it to where it is. Now, as I said, this fight involving a former UFC champion being put on by someone who the UFC hates and Jake Paul is very interesting. Jake Paul, MVP, they have not put on an MMA bout before. They've done a great job building up women's boxing with Carano and Katie Taylor and some of these other fighters. They've had battle for their cards. They even had that all-women's card to start the year this year with Amanda Serrano and Holly Holm and fighters, going for titles in that card in Puerto Rico. So they have been doing a great job with women's fighting. They have not crossed over in MMA in any facet. Of course, Jake Paul had a deal with the PFL, was supposed to be fighting for them maybe in his MMA debut and things like that. Never really came to fruition. That deal just ended this past year. But what is this now for MVP? Is this them opening the door to starting MMA promotions, to starting to have more of these fights, maybe at least a couple of times a year? They have a lot of guys that have fought for them against Jake Paul that are former UFC champions. You've had Anderson Silva. You had, Chris Marwin was supposed to fight Anderson Silva. You had Tyron Woodley, guys who are well past their prime but are still names in this game. You have a number of women's fighters that they could probably bring in here as that has started to be kind of underserved by the UFC. It seems there's plenty of women fighting in the BKFC, the PFL, that maybe, if they can get a little crossover, get involved, be on a Netflix card, it's good for them, good for the organizations they fight for. So is this something for MVP to open up a new avenue for them and start an MMA promotion with Netflix, who got spurred by the UFC, who was supposed to be signing them and bringing them onto their live sports portfolio, only to have Paramount swoop in and take it all for billions of dollars? Could this be the start of a fruitful relationship with MVP and Netflix, not just in boxing, but in MMA, especially women's MMA? Because if you've been following the UFC as much as me and some other people have, the last 6-8 months, there's been one, maybe two women's fights on these cards at most. It seems like, especially on the fight nights, they're getting buried. They're getting not much attention. Of course, we were supposed to have the Kayla Harrison and Amanda Nunes fight that was going to be a co-main event, but other than that, you're getting 1 to 2 fights at most on any of these cards with women fighters. Now, Invicta for years was doing things of, just promoting women and women's MMA. So does MVP try to step in there and take up that mantle and do what they've done with women's boxing and try to expand women's MMA even more so in the spotlight with the Netflix deal? That would be interesting. Do they bring in more of these fighters that aren't under contract for the UFC or some of these other organizations, but have enough of a name in MMA and start their own MMA arm of MVP? It'd be interesting to see. Not that they're going to challenge the UFC right away. Not that they're going to challenge them maybe ever, but could be enough of an alternative to get a lot of eyeballs, especially with a platform like Netflix. Does Ronda Rousey, Gina Carano give us a situation where it's the best fighters in the world fighting for who is the best? No. They are not the best women's fighters in MMA anymore. But it's going to get a hell of a lot of eyeballs because they're names. Watch the numbers on those Netflix cards. Not just what we've seen with Jake Paul fights, but the streaming numbers for Serrano and Taylor were huge. The streaming fights for any Jake Paul fight on Netflix have been huge. So now you're going to do it again with MVP and Netflix? That's going to get bigger numbers probably than a Paramount card. especially if you put enough of a lineup backing it. So this could be an interesting situation to open up a lot of avenues. And of course, there's going to be, maybe some others involved. Eddie Hearn was in rumors to be starting an MMA wing, maybe of Matchroom Boxing last year. And of course, Matchroom and MVP just worked on that Anthony Joshua Jake Paul fight. So is there a way that they combine and start something going on and get someone like, Taylor Serrano in MMA, or some other situation where Matchroom gets involved with MVP and creates an MMA wing? Who knows? There's a lot of questions that need to be answered with this. What is this going to be? Is this a one-off for MVP? Is this a one-off for Netflix? Or is this something that they're going to start to grow and build off of older names in MMA and maybe bringing in some new faces to try to build them up underneath? All that remains to be seen. But still, it's going to be a big fight with big numbers, even if they're not the two best in their prime at this point. And it leaves us a lot of questions about what's happening in the future with MVP, Netflix, and MMA. All right, next up is just a reminder that if you give Sean Strickland a microphone, he's going to be an embarrassment for himself, for the UFC, and just for the world in general. I mean, this guy went on such a rant this week between the media days, between interviews before the fight, interviews after the fight. And you just got to wonder why the UFC keeps letting him do this. I mean, first of all, before you even get to fight week and all the media obligations that he had, after this fight was announced, at one point, he throws up on social media a doctored picture of the fight poster where he is dressed as an ICE agent and Hernandez is complete in poncho and sombrero. Just a completely racist turn on this fight and making it about something it's not, and making it just grimy right off the bat. Then you get into a situation where you have media days and you give him a microphone and you ask him a bunch of questions. And what does he do with that microphone? What does he do with those answers? He gives you just rants that are completely misogynistic, sexist, homophobic, racist. Every is you can throw out there, he manages to hit them all with rants about the NFL and the Bad Bunny halftime show, with rants about Rousey and Carano, just degrading not just that fight, but women in general, talking about the only things they're good for are making babies and cooking dinner and cleaning the house, and going back to his youth about, what he did when Gina Carano was fighting to make himself, let's say, just feel good. He just continues to say the dumbest things that you could possibly think. This is like if you gave AI just freedom to roam in just the darkest corners of the internet. Don't let them see anything with any intelligence, with any research. Just give them the dumbest message boards and memes and social media to go check out, and then give them a microphone and let them talk. That is what Sean Strickland does every time you give him a mic. Now, the guy has talent. He can fight. He doesn't need to do this in order to get attention. He can do that with his fighting. And I know every time, you get into fight promotion, there's got to be a bad guy. There's got to be a heel. This guy just takes it to another level. He doesn't talk smack just to hype up the fight. He just attacks anybody and everybody and acts like he's the only thing that is perfect and right and good in this world. And everybody else is wrong and horrible, and just does it in the worst ways, whether it's because of your race, because of your sexual orientation, because of your gender. It just goes to new lows every time they let this guy talk. And it's a terrible representation of the UFC. Now, first of all, let's just not necessarily go through some of the statements of what he said, because I'm not going to repeat those things. But let's break down how stupid he is with what he says. Ripping Bad Bunny in the NFL, calling him fake American, ripping the Spanish, saying how terrible the NFL is in, very derogatory ways for the NFL and for homosexual people. First of all, Bad Bunny, that guy's way more popular than you'll ever be, no matter what language he's speaking. That guy streams more for his songs in a month than all your fights will ever stream combined. People are all going to care way more about him than they will ever care about you. And they're way more for this country trying to unite it with his halftime performance than any press conference you have ever given does. Whether it was in Spanish, English, plenty of great messages in there. to try to get people to just love each other and just be cool with things and just realize it's not just about you. You're not alone. So you're an idiot on that front. The NFL not being tough enough because of the things they do. Dude, it's just the dumbest, most basic thing that anybody ever says. And it's always spoken by people who would never go and take those hits, would never actually do that. That it's not tough enough because they try to not get guys concussed and broken down for the rest of their life. That's just stupid too. Now, talking about the Gina Carano and Ronda Rousey fight, about how who cares about that? No one's going to watch that. Yeah, people will watch that. In fact, I almost guarantee that the numbers on Netflix are going to dwarf the numbers of his fight on Paramount Plus. Not because it's a better fight. Him and Hernandez in their prime matter much more in the UFC, in the title picture. He's a former champion like Ronda Rousey. So as far as their careers go, where they're at right now, yes, their fight, him versus Hernandez, matters way more to fighting as it currently stands than Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano. But first of all, fight numbers on Netflix dwarf Paramount Plus when they have them. Second of all, those women have way more draw than he will ever have. Because it's not just about their fighting for them either. We don't know what their fighting is going to be like because they haven't fought in so long. We know what they left off as, but who knows what they'll be now. But that being said, they have way more marketability than he could even hope to have. Not just because of their looks, but because they have talent outside the cage as well. While Ronda Rousey's acting isn't going to win her any awards, I'm not going to put it up there as great. She did multiple movies, so it was good enough to get by and make her a ton of money. She did that with the WWE as well, with a ton of money, ton of fans. Gina Carano, she's actually had good acting performances. She was a lead in the movie and had a huge role in a bunch of different movies, including Fast and Furious movie, including The Mandalorian. Now, I don't agree with the comments that she made that got her fired. Don't also necessarily agree that they should have gotten her fired. They were stupid, but probably shouldn't have gotten her fired for that. But her acting career is way bigger and way more marketable than anything Sean Strickland will ever do in his life. So to put them down and act like they got nothing besides making babies and cooking for you, get the hell out of here. Those two women alone have way more value to the world than you will ever have. Plus, combine them, forget it. On Netflix, those numbers are going to blow yours out of the water, guaranteed. Plus, to say something so stupid in front of a bunch of media as everybody in that room could beat up Amanda Nunes, that just shows you know very little about your own sport. Because if you say that in some high-level gym, you go say that in Jackson Wink or ATT or one of these gyms to a bunch of, fully trained badass guys who are professional fighters, maybe you have a chance of that being right. Probably not when you're going to bring in the best like that, but you didn't say it there. You said it at a press conference in front of a bunch of media, okay? I've been to those press conferences. Half the people in that room couldn't take a punch, let alone throw one, and you're going to say that the best women's fighter in the history of the game right now couldn't beat them up? She could beat half those guys up at the same time. So don't act like, oh, women are nothing, they can't fight. She can kick a lot of guys' ass. If Amanda Nunes was coming down the side of the street, I might go the other way, and I'm 6'5", 260. So don't act like the media can fight against Amanda Nunes. There's a lot of professional fighters at lower weight classes that would have trouble against Amanda Nunes, let alone some guy who's in his basement typing 1,000 words on internet and has never gotten into a fight in his life. Get out of here. That's just uninformed and stupid as well. Every time you give this guy a mic, I think of the Billy Madison scene.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Now, the biggest problem with this is not just that he says the most horrible, stupid, inaccurate things that you could think of and put them out into the world for people to listen to, is that it's a terrible representation of the UFC. Every time you let guys like this speak, him, Bryce Mitchell, now, of course, Dana's going to say, oh, I can't silence him. It's about First Amendment, freedom of speech. But you're representing an organization when you give them that. When they have those banners behind them that say UFC, it makes people think that that's what the UFC is about. You can't think of it as freedom of speech. You can think of it as corporate communications, because these guys are making you look like idiots. They're making the UFC look like a bunch of Neanderthals going back to the days of people just thinking it was human cockfighting. Instead of highlighting the other things that can come of it, the good people that could be there, the effects they could have on kids to learn this discipline. Of course, yes, it's fighting, it's brawling, it's blood sport. So people are going to have some negativity to it. But any positivity, any good things you can highlight off of fighters or the organization and what they do or anything else is automatically erased every time this guy's on the screen and people are seeing that flood their Twitter, Instagram, and all social media feeds. Because now he is what the UFC is being represented by. You want to put him in there to fight because he's a good fighter? Sure. Don't let him talk like this, though, because it makes you look terrible. You don't need him to promote the fight by being a jackass. You're on Paramount. You're getting money either way. This isn't even a numbered card. This isn't pay-per-view buys anymore where you need to get people to rile up and hate him to tune in. You're getting your money for the next 7 years, and you can do it with other fighters pumping up other fights. The last thing you need with this guy is to run his mouth and make the organization look like a bunch of clowns, which is what happens every time you let him do this. Plus, let's face the fact, for all Dana White's bluster about First Amendment and not wanting to muzzle these guys, and, of course, blaming the media for the stupid things he says, because that's what he did this time. Well, what do you think is going to happen when you ask him about the NFL and bad money? No one did. I went back and watched that press conference again to make sure. Now, of course, it was a triggering question for him that they asked anyway, because they asked about heated rivalry. Of course, you asked this guy about a show with gay hockey players. He's going to go on some tangent that's going to be pretty terrible. So, yeah, still, again, not the brightest thing to say because, of course, someone's going to give that to him and he's going to run with it. But he went from a show about gay hockey players to Bad Bunny and the NFL halftime show. That's not a clear path. This guy was looking to meander. But anyway, Dana White talking about not wanting to muzzle these guys, and it is what it is. Well, that's not the case. Because sure, you let him go off on gay people, on women's sports, on other organizations, on other ethnicities. But there is always a place where they'll cut it off. Because that's literally what they did this weekend. When he started talking about Chimaev and his coaches and doing Muslim slang and saying terrible things of that racist nature, they cut off his mic and ended the press conference. When Bryce Mitchell talks about Hitler and insulting Jewish people, they come out and talk about how terrible it is and it doesn't represent them and this guy's an idiot. So if there's certain people that these guys go after, they will shut it down. But otherwise, they'll let them run rampant. I mean, this guy was basically in the ring talking about how one of the guy's coaches was a child predator. You let it go, but the second he starts insulting the religion of some of your partners, that's when you'll cut off the mic. We'll draw a line. I mean, you got pissed at Brock Lesnar back in the day when he insulted Bud Light and said, they ain't paid me nothing, so I'm drinking Coors. If it affects their money, if it affects their partnerships, they'll shut it down. Then all of a sudden, their free speech doesn't matter because then it's about the bottom dollar. So don't act like you just let these guys be them all the time, anytime, and it's all okay because freedom of speech. Because when it affects your bottom dollar, when it affects your partners, when it insults the wrong people, all of a sudden, lo and behold, press conference over. And let's not forget, too, this guy acts tough, and he is the last great American. He's going to save the world with his genius opinions. And he could dish it out to anybody. But when you talk about certain things that trigger him, all of a sudden that's not okay. Because when Sean O'Malley and DDP were going after him about his past, about childhood trauma he suffered, that wasn't okay. He's on podcasts crying about that and how that's not cool. And I'm not saying what they said was okay. I'm against that too. There's promoting a fight, and then there's taking things too far. But if this guy's going to go on all these tangents, ripping everybody in the world and saying the most vile things about them, then they have free reign to go back at you. If you're going to open Pandora's box, you can't be upset when a monster comes out of it. All right, one of the all-time greats is apparently going to get back into the ring. Floyd Mayweather Jr. will return to boxing. No, I am not talking about that Mike Tyson exhibition fight that he's going to fight in April. Yes, he is going to do that. We've seen those from him before with various other shenanigans and ridiculousness of getting into the ring with someone who's no business being there with him. And of course, it somehow goes all the way to the end, doesn't get the finish he should. Just a ridiculous show for a bunch of money. But after that exhibition, he is apparently going to return to fighting professionally for the first time in 9 years. That's right, the undefeated former champion will return to professional boxing once again. Not just these exhibition things, these shams that he keeps putting on every once in a while. He's going to return to actually getting in the ring against professional fighters and trying to compete for titles. As I said, at 48 years old, after not fighting professionally for 9 years. Now, of course, he is one of the greatest of all time. He's one of the only undefeated fighters to ever go through a boxing career as such. Multiple time, multiple division, unified champion, one of the best to ever get in there. And didn't take a lot of shots throughout his career. Was a very defensive fighter, a lot of movement, outpointing guys, wasn't in there trying to take heads and get his taken off as well. So at this age, even though he's coming back, he's going to be a little slower. So we'll see if that defense is still the same. But the skill and the chin are probably still going to be okay as far as that goes. But is he going to compete at the level he was against the best, against these younger guys? Of course, we saw his rival Pacquiao come back and has done decently, did much better in that Mario Barrios fight than I thought he would. Of course, we've seen Mario Barrios falter ever since. He just lost his title to Ryan Garcia. We'll talk about more of that on the next episode. But can he do the same? I think it's a little different. I think his style is different. He could probably get in there with some of these young bucks and give him a good fight. But the bigger question is why? Why is he doing this at this age, at this point? And I think, of course, the answer to that is why most of these guys come back. We don't know for sure. It's not confirmed, but I think it's about money, which seems ridiculous with the amounts that he made. But when you saw how he lived and you see what's been in the news recently, that seems to be the logical trail. I mean, I've been there with this guy doing interviews where he is showing up with not just a fancy watch on. He has a guy with a backpack that has a whole roll of $100,000, $500,000, $1 million watches, all there with them, stacks of cash. You've seen all the videos of him going out to party, the strip club, to the bottle service, all these things that he was doing, the private jets, the cars in Vegas and Miami, same cars, just different color. I mean, the guy was, of course, ripping through money left and right, but he had a ton of it, so it wasn't going to be a problem. Well, that comes back to bite everyone once they retire. Once the money's not coming in, and it's going out at the same pace, all of a sudden, there seems to be a lot less of it than before. And it seems like he's trying to get some of that. As we saw in a lawsuit that he filed recently against Showtime, Steven Espinoza, the former head of Showtime Sports, and his former manager, Al Heyman, a guy who, by all reports, was like family to him. A guy who was staying in the shadows, but was running his career, was doing everything business-wise to make him be not just a megastar, but the mega multi-$100 million athlete that he was, helping him start the PBC. But now he's suing him and Espinoza and Showtime for $340 million. When you're throwing around that kind of a lawsuit, you need the money. Not that you're ever going to let people just screw you over and take your money, but with a huge figure like that, that 9 years after his retirement, all of a sudden is coming out. This isn't a lawsuit that was going on. This isn't a year or two after he retired. He's checking the books and saying, wait a second, what's going on? This is almost a decade after he fought that he's suing these guys. And now he's coming back to boxing at the same time. Floyd Mayweather made a ton of money, but it seems like he needs some more of it. Seems like there's something else going on behind the scenes, because he was content to walk out on his terms, undefeated, one of the best ever. But now all of a sudden, after years of exhibitions and partying, he's coming back. This doesn't often go well. We'll see what he does with it. We'll see if he's different than a lot of these other guys who come back later in life because they need the money before, or the cash or the prestige, or maybe it's just the limelight. Whatever the reasoning, out for a decade, coming back in your late 40s, rarely goes well for any of these guys. We'll see if it goes any better for him, but I'm not expecting it to. Just because he was amazing and one of the best ever does not mean he still is against guys of a different era. Now, the PFL announced a bunch more fights coming up for them in the last week or so. So let's talk about some of those right now. Well, they continue to move from the Middle East to Europe and now across the U.S. again, as we went from Dubai to Spain to Pittsburgh. Now, April 11th in Chicago, as Sergio Pettis will take on Mitchell McKee in that fight as the headliner. You also have Newman versus Silveira in the middleweight battle there as well. So some highly ranked fighters on this card again. Pettis wanted a title fight in his next fight in Milwaukee. Doesn't get quite that, but gets close to home here in Chicago, but not the title fight. And again, what are we doing with some of these fights? They're making some good battles, they're making some good cards, but if you're going to start this era where you are doing title fights, where you are getting belts in the PFL for the first time, not just tournament belts, but actual champions, let's get some more of these going early on. You had the lightweight battle, you had the welterweight in that first card. You're going to have middleweight, of course, with the Vanstinas, but why are we fighting guys like AJ McKee and Sergio Pettis and not in title fights? Let's get it going. Let's get these belts on somebody so then you can build up challengers, build up divisions, build up races to fight for those titles. It's a very dangerous game they're playing sometimes when they're having these top contenders in these rankings they release not fight for titles, because then you have a Jesus Pinedo put on a stinker of a performance and now he's knocked out of the title picture and you got to redo things. So I love that they're getting some of these guys back in action. I love that we're putting on more cards and a lot in the U.S. That's great. Moving around the country, trying to build things up for the PFL, trying to build up the audience. But let's get some more titles for some of these top-ranked fighters, because it just doesn't make sense to keep fighting them against other guys when you're not putting a strap around them and building up those divisions in that way. We're also finding out more and more of what's going to happen on the main cards of some of these other ones coming up in March as they start to fill those out and let us know the lineups. Let's go to that March 28th card in Pittsburgh, where we already knew that you're going to get Eblen versus Battle. Kind of a weird matchup. Of course, Johnny Eblen not fighting for the title because Vanstinas is defending it for the first time in a different fight in Spain. But he is fighting against Battle as the headliner of that one. We also found out now, middleweight, you got Rosta versus Kasanganay, number 5 and number 3 in the middleweight rankings. That one could have some serious title implications. You got the Silva and Inaba there, women's flyweight at 125. Seeing if some of them can get into the mix. Of course, Inaba fought against Dakota Ditcheva and it did not go her way, but put on a valiant effort, went all the way. Can she get herself back into the title mix? You also have a featherweight battle between Pergande and Arce, and then a bantamweight battle between Dayron and Thrall. So some lower ranked fighters in the top 10 there, but some important battles in those top 3 fights. Also finding out more of the main card there in Spain, March 20th. You are, of course, as we said, headline between Vanstinas and Edwards for the middleweight title. McKee and Borich, which is a fight that I think should be for a title. Number 2, number 4, throw a strap on one of these guys. It makes no sense to keep it away while you're waiting for someone else to fight for it. Lightweight battle between Chablis and Duque, number 5 in the division versus unranked. Franco Tenaglia making his PFL debut in the welterweight division there, going against Najid, of course, has a big following in Spain with his MMA fights there. And then an interesting fight at heavyweight between Vassal and Golstov, number 4 and number 3 in that division, and a rematch between those two guys. So that could be a very big fight, determining who goes next against Nemkov if we do not get a battle against Francis Ngannou. A lot of things are up in the air, of course, in all these divisions, but that could be a big factor in who gets a title shot, and that would be a very interesting battle to watch. So we're starting to find out more and more from the PFL on what is coming up for them on these cards. Looking forward to them getting back in action next month. All right, before we get out of here, let's talk about some other news that we had coming out in combat sports. First of all, while I'm not happy that the PFL is not putting on some more title fights, there is one coming up in the UFC. We've kind of been waiting for that, as of course they had that interim lightweight title. We have the BMF title, but we didn't have a lot of these champions in action just yet. Well, we're going to get one of them in April as Joshua Van gets his first title defense with the flyweight belt around his waist. And that will come not against Pantoja, the former champion who he took it off of in that freak injury. It will come against Tatsuro Taira, the Japanese fighter on a great win streak coming in here. Has had some impressive wins. Now, there were rumors, of course, about maybe waiting for Pantoja because, of course, he was a great champion in that division and giving him that respect of getting the immediate rematch. But I guess they're going to give him some more time to heal up. And instead of waiting and holding up that division while he heals up and gets ready to fight again, they are going to throw in this up-and-comer from Japan, Taira, on a nice win streak, has some exciting wins. And then that will be the first battle for Van. Of course, this was also maybe announced to happen in Japan as they're working on a card for that in April or May. Instead of waiting for that to come to fruition, or who knows, maybe it's not, they just decide to get Van in there and get his first title defense under his belt. And he will do that in April in Miami against Tatsuro Taira. That should be an awesome fight. Looking forward to the striking battle between those two guys. We also had a war of words that finally turned into some action. As, of course, there's been a long-standing back and forth between Dana White and Eddie Hearn. White of the UFC, of course, and Zuffa Boxing. And Eddie Hearn, the promoter for Matchroom Boxing over in the UK. A lot of fights here in the US as well. Of course, the promoter of Anthony Joshua, Katie Taylor, and previously, Conor Benn. So first we had Dana White after Zuffa 3 talking to the press and about how so far the way they've been running through boxing in their mind, it's like beating up babies, and ripped guys like Eddie Hearn for being a Nepo baby because of his dad building up Matchroom Boxing, and talking about how they're just going to run through this sport and it's been easy. No one's really given them a challenge, despite the numbers for Zuffa probably not being huge right now, fighting just in the apex and nobody really paying too much attention just yet. So Eddie Hearn responded later in the week to the comments made by Dana White, calling him a Nepo baby, saying, well, what are you without your friends the Fertittas who bought the UFCs? They were the money. You didn't build that up. Your friends bought it and they just put you in charge. And now you have your big corporate overlords at TKO and Turki Al-Sheikh throwing a bunch of money at you from Saudi Arabia. So basically that everyone else is floating the bill and you're just playing with their money, doing what you do. Now, of course, that's oversimplifying it. Of course, Dana has done a great job to build up all those organizations. It wasn't his money, but it was his brains. It was a lot of his hard work. It was him being out there as the face of it that helped build it to what it is in many ways. So maybe not the most fair critique, but after the back and forth in words, Dana White says, okay, you want to see what I can do? He steals one of Eddie Hearn's fighters, one of his top fighters. Now, of course, Eddie Hearn promotes Anthony Joshua, Katie Taylor. Those are probably his top two draws, but his third draw probably was a guy named Conor Benn, who is now fighting for Zuffa Boxing. We'll see how far it goes. Now, rumors are that it is a one-fight, $15 million deal, but the 29-year-old middleweight is coming in there and signing with Zuffa, 24-1 in his career, coming off getting revenge for his only career loss after dominating Chris Eubank Jr. in their rematch. There's some good numbers over there in the UK for that one and around the world. But he was, as I said, one of the three biggest stars for Matchroom Boxing, probably. And this is the biggest name Zuffa has signed, the most legit in his prime fighter right now, probably. Not a champion, but still a big name to bring into the fold and pay a lot of money. Now, of course, there's rumors of Andy Ruiz probably coming to Zuffa as well, the former heavyweight champion, but not exactly in his prime, in his late 30s. Hasn't won a couple fights here lately, so that's not as big a signing as Conor Benn won. And as I said, throwing big money around for that. $15 million for this one fight. Boxing and the way it's going, especially with the way that Zuffa wants it to go, is not about paying guys huge money to fight. Now, of course, they did that for Terrence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez to make their name for Turki Al-Sheikh in the boxing world. But these Zuffa cards, these 1, 2, and 3 that they've done, and the ones that they're going to do going forward, whether it's at the Apex or other little venues, they're not about huge stars, big money, making a big entrance. I'm assuming this is to help them, of course, go over to the UK and bring in a big audience there when they decide to go overseas and probably take it out of the Meta Apex. But that's a lot of money to pay for that guy for one fight. Is he the draw of a Bud Crawford or Canelo Alvarez or some of these other title fights that we've seen? No, he doesn't even have a title. But he's going to bring in a UK audience, and more importantly, it hurts a rival in Eddie Hearn. we'll see if that 15 million pays off. At the very least, it pisses off their rival and maybe opens up a new market for them. But very interesting signing. And I mean, I didn't even know the guy was a free agent. I didn't know he was looking. It seemed like him and Eddie Hearn were joining at the hip. And it seemed like Eddie Hearn was really hurt at him leaving. You know, he talked about afterwards that he got an email from them saying this was happening. And he's like, hey, let's have a talk. You know, give me a chance. Like, I've been with you forever. And Conor and his people wouldn't even take his call. So I don't know if the relationship wasn't as rosy as we thought it was, or if it's just that the money spoke too much and he didn't want to take a chance of Eddie changing his mind. But either way, that's a rough way to lose one of your top fighters who you've done a lot for. Just have him turn his back like that on a dime to go sign for big money elsewhere. Now we'll see if the relationship is repaired and he comes back. So as I said, one fight, 15 million. See if we can put that up once. Do they do that every time? Also, what kind of precedence does it set? What do you think the rest of these fighters are thinking if you're paying this guy that much for one fight? Especially, what do you think of some of these UFC fighters are going to think? When you're making $1 billion plus per year on their contract, and they're not even making $1 million, and you're paying this guy 15 for a fight? That's a bold move by Zuffa to try to break into boxing even more so, to try to break into the UK and try to hurt one of their rivals. But there's going to be questions remaining about whether that backfires on them in the end. We'll see. Still, a big steal for Zuffa Boxing. That's going to do it for this episode of Fighting Lines with Brian Ciano. I'll be back shortly in your feeds with a new episode breaking down everything that happened this past weekend. Of course, we have the UFC Fight Night card, where you had a win for Sean Strickland over Anthony Hernandez, and a bunch of other fights we'll talk about as well. There was boxing title fight between Mario Barrios and Ryan Garcia, where we see a whole new side of Ryan Garcia. And there was also a women's title fight as well, Claressa Shields back in the mix as well. We'll also preview the UFC Fight Night we have coming up this weekend in Mexico between Moreno and Kavanagh, and touch on all other news that's coming out of combat sports in the next couple of days. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure wherever you're finding us, whether it's Apple, YouTube, or Spotify, like, subscribe, comment, send it to people. Get it out there for people to join and be part of this show. And follow us on social media at Fighting Lines on X and at Fighting Lines Pod on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook. We'll put out more clips of the show and other things always throughout the week here with Fighting Lines with Brian Ciano. Talk to you soon.